Well, it is still a very great pleasure for me to introduce the last, but by no means the least of the conference's keynote speaker, Silvia Bernardini. Silvia is Professor of English Linguistics and Translation at the Department of Interpreting and Translation of the University of Bologna, where she teaches translation from English into Italian and corpus linguistics. She's one of the pioneers of corpus-based translation studies. In her research, she has approached every aspect of translation studies, and I really mean every aspect, and published widely on all of them. She has actively contributed to the compilation of innovative corpora, such as the European Parliament Interpreting Corpus Epic, recently extended to become the intermodal eptic corpus, the European Parliament Translation and Interpreting Corpus. She has also been closely involved in the Web as Corpus WOCI initiative, which resulted in the compilation of very extensive linguistically processed web-crawled corpora covering a wide range of languages. Many of her publications focus on the importance of rigorous corpus design and contain methodological guidelines for the analysis of multilingual corpora. Her publications show a strong determination to take corpus-based translation studies outside the confines of academia and to highlight their relevance for European institutions and industry. Teaching has always been at the forefront of her research, and many of her publications have a strong pedagogic slant. She's a staunch advocate of data-driven learning, which she refers to as discovery learning, an approach which, and I quote, views learners as explorers and corpora as realms to be explored. She has evaluated the potential of this approach in a range of studies and shone a spotlight on its implications for translation education. Although most of her work has focused on translation studies, she was one of the first scholars to investigate the links between translation and other varieties of English, of language, not English, not English in particular. And in particular, among these varieties, non-native writing. Her work on so-called constrained language varieties, which involve bilingual activation, is of great relevance for learner corpus researchers. In her earliest paper in this area, published in 2010, she highlighted the benefit of comparing non-native and translated language and presented the results of a preliminary corpus-based investigation of the resultive connector, therefore. Her most recent study, published this year, presents the result of a corpus-driven study of part-of-speech dependency diagrams. In both cases, commonalities between translated and learner language were identified. Silvia's strong interest in phraseology, one of the most popular areas of research in LCR, is another meeting point between her research and LCR. Her interest in all things phraseological goes back a long way, as phraseology was already the focus of her PhD. Since then, she has tackled a wide range of topics with a particular focus on collocation. Another aspect of her research that is of great relevance to LCR is her involvement in the compilation and analysis of learner translation corpora. With over 500 translations already collected, Silvia and her team are one of the most active contributors to the Multilingual Student Translation Project, a project coordinated by Marie-Aude Lefebvre and myself at Louvain, which aims to collect a large corpus of translations produced by translation trainees and foreign language learners. It is about this aspect of her work that she will be talking today. We are all extremely eager to hear her speak, so without further ado, I'll hand over the floor to her. Please join me in giving Sylvia a big round of applause.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Sylviane. I'm glad this is being recorded because I will have my family listen to it and say, Sylviane Granger said this of me. Let's see if my presentation is there. Control L. Okay, I hope it shows okay. And I'll yes, indeed, I'll be speaking about translation learner corpora and the relationship with learner corpora in general. And I'll be talking about the masked corpus, but also about a data set that I've been struggling with recently. So I've given another talk 2 days ago on a related topic, and there as well, I said, I don't think plenaries are for me to teach you anything. I mean, you are much more knowledgeable than I am in many, many fields central to this community. So I think what I will aim to do here is first try to show you a different way of looking at a set of data that you may not think has been particularly relevant to you, but also asking for your help with problems I'm personally struggling with. So I'm very open in this. Okay, a marriage of two minds. Let's see if these two minds are also true minds, as in Shakespeare's sonnet. So my outline, I will first of all speak briefly about learner translation corpora. For those of you who are not familiar with the notion that Sylviane has already introduced, I'll be talking about the masked corpus, even though it shouldn't be me talking about it, since Sylviane is the initiator together with Marie-Aude Lefer of this initiative, which I think is doing a lot of good to our field. And then I will move on to talk about learner language and translation. So what are the commonalities, but also the differences, and why it might make sense to see the two as related, not just in terms of translation being a different task through which you can get data from learners, but also as a communication setting, as a communication mode on its own. So I will ask you and myself, are they related or unrelated research objects? And I will try to illustrate this with a little study that I've been conducting together with my colleague Adriano Ferraresi on collocations, which is my main research interest on constrained language, but also using the gravitational pull hypothesis, which is a hypothesis that has been made within translation studies by Sandra Halverson. So I will briefly introduce that and show you how we're trying to conceptualize the issue of collocations within a constrained communication approach using the gravitational pull hypothesis. And then I will list a few questions, open questions or issues that I think we might think about. And I'll finish on an afterthought if I can show you a video, which will allow me not to have a real conclusion. All right, so learner translation corpora or translation learner corpora, LTCs. Learner translation corpora, just picked one definition, are multiple parallel corpora with, or sets of multiple parallel data sets, let's say, with one source text and usually multiple translations. The output of a class of translation students who hand in their translations to the lecturer, and then we collect those. Okay, so for any one source text, we have several translations produced by groups of trainee translators. I think there's no need to be so specific. It's a set of translations produced by someone for whom that output is central to their learning. So it can be translation students, but it can also be language students who use translation in a pedagogic manner, or whose lecturers use translation in a pedagogic manner. Under various conditions that are documented in the metadata, and usually featuring some translation error annotation. So the main difference with the traditional learner corpora is that this is a parallel set of data. Now, you can think of translation corpora as on a line of naturalness as being less natural, possibly, than other kinds of production, because of learner data being derivative, or because translation learner data are somehow derivative of a source text. So the learners are not free in their expression of meanings in the text because they have to convey someone else's meanings. So in that sense, Gattanay says they may be considered peripheral learner corpora, and indeed they may be, but obviously center and periphery depends on your standpoint. Right? So obviously from the standpoint of traditional learner corpora, translation learner corpora may be considered peripheral learner corpora, and for sure they differ from other types of learner data. But for translation trainers, for translation teachers, in fact, they are extremely central and also very, very useful, because one of the problems we have when we teach translation is that you have to try and put all these translations together on this was from the very early, probably one of the first studies on translation learner data, where Bowker and Benison say, we want this data set, we want to create these data sets because otherwise we end up having 30 translations on the same desk, and how are we ever going to be fair also to the students and mark them in the same way when you don't even have space enough to fit all those on a single desk. So since 2003, in fact, there has been a collection, the collection of learner translation corpora has grown. So I'll show you a long list on this page. It will be in the recording, so I'm not going to say anything about all these projects, but it can be useful for you, first of all, to see the references, and also because you get an idea of the range of languages and language pairs that are available in different projects. I'm sure that many are missing from this list, and maybe some people you know or even yourselves have been involved in the collection of learner translation corpora that are not on this. So this is not an exhaustive list, but it can show you that the field is reasonably strong and growing. But I'm going to focus on the multilingual student translation corpora, the MUST corpus that, as Sylviane just said, we've been involved with. So the multilingual student translation corpus, I'm going to give you some data from the latest workshop that took place at UC Louvain last November. Again, so that you get a feeling for the size and the complexity of the project. 46 participant groups from 21 countries. Italy is quite strongly represented, I think, with several source texts and many student translations. So as you can see, the proportion is always like that. So fewer source texts and many translations in many different languages, and a total of almost 2 million words, which may seem small, but when you think about how many short texts are there and how many translations, you realize that this is quite it's a very, very important project. We've never seen anything of the kind in translation studies. Briefly about error annotation for learner translation corpus. You probably can't see this very well, but even though I was involved in the Melange project, I had to download this from the web, this error annotation framework, and it doesn't show very well. But I wanted it here because this was an early attempt, and if you look at it in comparison with the MUST error annotation or annotation framework, there are several differences, mainly that the MUST error annotation system is more methodologically sound, let's say, while the Melange attempt was an attempt where we tried to come up with a common sense view of what teachers, translation teachers might want to annotate, the must framework is in fact much more rigorous in terms of not trying to account for the causes or the expected, hypothesized causes of some of the of what we see in the text, but rather trying to be more descriptive. We've been in Forlì, but I think other groups as well, trying to test this system. Several of our lecturers are not completely happy with it, of course, because this is you know what the way it should be. So a tool is created, it is tested, it is modified, and then it becomes better. So especially for translation into the native language, because must doesn't specify that you have to translate either into your native language or out of your native language. So it's open about that. So especially for translation into the native language, there are certain areas that need to be, I think, more developed, particularly the register and style part, and also the culture part. But anyway, I'll just to illustrate the kinds of data that we're dealing with and hopefully make you think that you might want to build a learner translation corpus or add to MUST. I'll show you what our data look like. So this was the latest text that I added with my students, with my BA students in the BA in English to Italian language mediation, from Italian into English. Most of my students are Italian, as you will see. This text was selected because it is copyright free, so no problem there for sharing or making it available. And I'm going to focus on this part sentence here. Even though Australia is a country of migrants, its current treatment to refugees and asylum seekers is cause for both domestic and international outrage. And in particular, I'll be focusing cause for outrage, okay, and show you how my 30-something students translated this. Okay, so I don't know whether this is readable or understandable, but here you have all the cases in which they use the verb plus a noun. Okay, so provoca indignazione. They're all obviously translations of cause outrage, but with different verbs or in some cases different verbs and different nouns. And here you have all the cases in which they translated that part sentence, that collocation, with a noun and another noun. Okay, so it's cause of. Okay, so this here is the same construction as you have in English, and then we have two outliers. Let's say two different solutions, which were these ones: in un modo che suscita oltraggio, in a way that raises outrage, and has shaken people. Okay, so these two are different, but the rest follow very closely these two structures, either a verb and a noun, or a verb preposition verb. Now, if we look at the corpus from a parallel perspective, okay, we have basically this. If you go to the sketch engine where I uploaded this corpus, you have one source and 33 translations of that source. And you can look at all the variation there, or lack of variation, where all the students basically provided very, very similar outputs. Okay, so you can see both. Now, MUST has a lot of metadata, very, very substantial, very demanding also on the students. But one of the metadata that we have is the native language of the students. So you can also easily see that these the solutions in pink are by non-native speakers of Italian in class. So you can remove those if you want and only look at the output of Italians, or you can include them and try to see if it makes a difference that they are non-native speakers or native speakers of Romanian, French, Spanish, and French again. This is the set of metadata available for MUST, not readable again, but it gives you an idea of how, you know, what we're recording. And the student mother tongue is down here. Now, the same corpus can also be used in a sort of pseudo-comparable perspective. So it's pseudo in the sense that I don't have a comparable native component that I'm going to show you. I'm just going to show you reference data in Italian from a general reference corpus. But it's you could look at, for instance, all these noun pairs that we get from the students and compare it with the reference corpus of Italian. This is IT 1010, so not comparable at all, but you get a general idea. the general idea is that out of all these nouns, causa is not there. It might be there lower down, but it's not among the top words, nouns that are used together with di indignazione. You have motivo down here, and motivo was the top choice. So the solution that the students, that the highest number of students chose, motivo di indignazione. But basically what Italians, I think, would understand from this is that in fact, this idea of cause for outrage is usually expressed in Italian with a verb plus a noun that says what this outrage looked like, whether it was fast, whether it was big. So you have a wave of indignation, a movement, a feeling, a sense, a cry, but you need a verb saying, you know, that was something that caused that cry, that sense, that something. Okay, so in fact, the verb solutions here would seem to be slightly more in line with the way in which that notion would be expressed in Italian, but you can only get that from a comparable perspective. Now, moving on. Now, I think you got a very clear idea about, you know, the affordances, the kind of data that I'm describing, what they can offer you. So I'm going to move on to thinking about what these data, or how these data could be used, not just as an addition to traditional learner data or for studying translation, but together with traditional learner data to go beyond our generalizations about the typical features of translation on one hand and learner production. So, well, I'll start from the more didactic and societal perspective, because I think that's where we have to be relevant. So that's a claim I always make. Research is important, but you have to be relevant to society. So there has been a movement in language teaching and also in society in general for a revival of translation in language teaching. I was educated in a very strongly communicative framework where you don't ever use contrastive observations, or your native language is useless. Now we know that in fact relying on the native language can be very useful in teaching, and so there's a closer attention to translation as an instructive strategy. So translation as a pedagogic tool, but also the 2018 new description of the competencies in foreign language use, apart from mentioning mediation, but mediation had been there from the start. However, now they have produced a much more detailed description of the competencies that relate to mediation, that are fully part of our language competence, including translating written texts and translating spoken texts, not professionally, but as part of how we use languages. From the viewpoint of research instead, sorry, there's quite substantial common ground, I think, between the study of second language, bilingualism, and learner language and translation. One aspect that has been pointed out by both communities is that of cross-linguistic influence or transfer, where in both types of production, you get clear instances of the source text shining through the target text. And one might wonder, and that's one of the interesting questions, if the availability of a source text constraining production in the target language will result in more transfer or not. So that would be a hypothesis that we are partly trying to investigate here, but a hypothesis that I think would be worth investigating more closely. At the same time, there has also been research on so-called reduction phenomena. So the idea that that you will see fewer items or patterns in the target language if these are not also shared by the source language in both translation and bilingual language use. So these reduction phenomena, in translation studies, you would hear about unique items, the unique items hypothesis, which again is, it was developed mainly, I think, to do with grammar structures in Finnish in particular, where if you have a structure that has no counterpart in the source language, you're likely not to see it in the target language simply because there's no stimulus for that. And the claim that we all sort of think about constantly, the same cognitive mechanisms operating in second language acquisition and bilingual language use may underlie the translation process and shape its linguistic outcome. That's the basic point. However, and of course, there are other phenomena that have been pointed out in both fields, like conservatism, so being more conservative, more explicit or analytic, simpler, both in translation and in second language use. However, some scholars have also pointed out that indeed they may be similar, but they're also different for several reasons. And the main reason I'd say is that, as I mentioned repeatedly, in translation, you have a constraining source text. So meanings that have been already encoded linguistically in a text that you have to render in the other text. Quite an old book now on relevance theory, this was referred to as interpretive language use rather than descriptive language use. So translation would be a kind of similar to an explanation of a picture, but where you have a source that is also linguistically encoded. Okay, so that's the main difference with other types of text production. Again, translation is interpretive use, and therefore it's quite possible, that's the hypothesis, that we will see some similarities because of what you saw before, the bilingual activation, etc., but also some differences due to these different situations and different constraints operating. Okay, so I've been at 2 conferences in the last week, and at both I saw papers in which there were references to translation and other kinds of text production. On one hand, in this place, citing scholars who claim that, in fact, translation can be used as a sort of externalized way of understanding how people would understand texts, but externalized. So rather than asking someone, how would you make sense of this? If you look at a translation, you can see how that person interpreted that text. So externalize evidence of an actual user response and audience design as well, because of course translators have an idea of who their audience is and try to write their text for their audience. At the same time, another conference is translating fundamentally different from other language tasks. Evidence from psycholinguistics seem to go in the direction saying, yes, process-wise, when you understand the text for translation, you're operating differently because you're focusing on different aspects. Certainly intralingual, translating is more taxing than intralingual paraphrasing. So understanding a text in the source and paraphrasing it in the same language would be more less difficult, than intralingual translation. So again, similarities and differences. Now, the paper that how much time do I have, Sylviane? About 15?
You started late, so
yeah.
I don't know whether we can perhaps extend,
okay.
Because it wouldn't be fair.
All right, but you'll tell me when I have 10 minutes, right? Okay. So I'll go briefly, or I hope briefly, through the study that I've been struggling with lately, so where I'll need your help. The study brings together collocations, the constraint model that I'll show you in a moment, and the gravitational pull hypothesis. So I'm going to go through these 3 juggling balls quickly and then show you how we're trying to make sense of this. First of all, the constraint model. This is recent work by Heidi Kotze, who has suggested that that because we're trying to make sense of the different constraints operating on translation and other kinds of language use, such as bilingual language use, then we have to account for all these different constraints, which may be both cognitive and social, and the way in which they shape a probabilistic grammar that we see then in these different kinds of text production. And she mentions 5 factors that to her are central for this analysis, and then obviously also other minor, let's say, possible variables. So language activation, whether it's multilingual or monolingual. So in the case of intralingual paraphrasing and translation, you would have this kind of activation of different language activation. Modality and register aspects, text production, whether it's dependent or independent. This would be the translation versus, say, original or writing type of production, and the proficiency of the user in language terms, but also task expertise, whether the person is expert or non-expert in the task that they're carrying out, which is a big issue for translation, especially because if you compare published writing to student translations, you're actually comparing. This is something that Hilary talked about as well in the plenary yesterday. You are not simply comparing translated to non-translated, but you're also comparing student work to published work. And in published work, obviously you have an expertise dimension, but you also have editors intervening. Probably you have a stronger commitment because you know that you'll be read by a wider audience that students may not have. So building comparable corpora, in this case, also translations is an issue. Plus, Heidi mentions all sorts of micro-level constraints that relate to the individual and to the context of production. So it becomes a very complex framework that you're probably all familiar with, because I'm pretty sure that it applies similarly to also the kind of data that you're working with, plus the fact that in this case, we also have two different fields with all their different constraints that we try to bring together. So that makes everything even more complex. So in the case of L2 writing and translation, the data that I'm going to show in a moment, we have this difference between independent and dependent text production. Then just one slide on collocations in learner language and translated language. Okay, so you know that I cannot hope to exhaust the topic at all. But you probably also are familiar with this literature, so I don't have to go through it. In both translation and L2 or learner use, there has been substantial evidence of a transfer, for sure, starting with Nesselhoff, but even before with Sylviane's papers, etc. Target language effects as well, so more normalization, conventionality and convergence. The frequency and versus salience effects I'm going to talk about in a moment. So we have more reliance on frequent phrases, but less salient phrases. So you can think of this as an opposition between, say, mutual information and T-score, which is, we're going to use log dice in place of T-score, but we have the same opposition in the paper that I'm going to talk about, and phrasal teddy bear. So these are all aspects that have to do with conventionality, with convergence towards center, less diversity in both translated and learner language. And I only have a very short list here of references, I was reading it this morning and I could think of about 5 or 6 that are not there and that should be. Okay. Then my third component for this is the gravitational pull hypothesis. I'm pretty sure that you're not familiar, or unless you've worked on translation, you're probably not familiar with this hypothesis. So I'll show you what it's like. So the hypothesis that Sandra Halvorsen made is that salience of linguistic items of different kinds, both lexical and grammatical, are more likely to be chosen by translators if they are salient. And then she goes on to explain what she means by salience. So if an item is salient, it's more likely for it to be overrepresented in translated data. And she has recently revised their original hypothesis and has come up with 3 categories of salience. One would be so-called target language salience or magnetism. So the target language would push the translator to choose a linguistic item, a construction or a lexical item, a phrase that is very salient in the target language. So that would be one effect the translators have. The other one would be the opposite, source language prominence. Okay, so this would lead to transfer, would lead to transfer if the source language item again is very salient in the source language, and connectivity would be the third. So the fact that 2 items are strongly connected so that you don't have to go deep in your processing and back, because you have sort of a dictionary equivalent or a translational equivalent that is already available to you. So you don't, it's almost like a default translation, it's been called as well, or automatic, not in the sense of machine, but automatic translation, where you don't have to think about it because it's obvious. Okay. So she describes these three, and she says, well, we could go out and investigate the effect of these three different forces in translation and what translated text looks like. Okay, so we're trying to adopt these three parts, right? The gravitational pull hypothesis, the constraint framework, and trying to apply it to collocations. And it's not been easy. So let me restate the three research questions in terms of the previous slide. So we're trying to find out if translations into English and essays written in English, the constraint language hypothesis, by our students, Italian students of translation, differ in the level of collocationality that they show as quantified by log dice and neutral information. Secondly, and this is the more exploratory, qualitative, tiny, little investigation that we try to do, we want to look at whether these collocations that our students produce in the two modes tend to derive from strong connectivity, so that when they produce a strong collocation, a salient collocation, it's simply because it's there in their mind, so it's memorized, or it's there in the dictionary. And thirdly, once we've identified the sources for these collocations, we try to see if those are also salient or frequent in Italian. Okay? And then we try to make sense of whether the two modes of production differ because of these three forces, if these three forces apply differently to translation and L2 writing. Okay, the data set, which is terrible. It's really terrible. It's more than opportunistic. It's basically, we asked our students, can you please send us your translations that you've done, whatever translation you've done for work, for homework, for exams, anything you have into English, give it to us. We have no idea how they did these translations, whether they were timed, whether they used CAP tools, dictionaries, and so on. We have no idea. We got everything they sent us. Some students sent us 12 translations, some students sent us 1. In any possible, see, I'm coming really clean about the data set. Okay, so completely opportunistic. We had no idea if we could find some common ground for comparing these two data sets. So they don't want to spend 1 year collecting data and then finding that you don't know how to analyze it. So we said, okay, let's start with whatever we can find, try to see if we can find a method, and then we'll build from there. Okay, so that's what the corpus looks like. So I have to be quick about it. A mess, complete mess. Okay, 19 students in the translation corpus and 106 students in the essay corpus. The essays are much longer. They're all on corpus linguistics, but different prompts. The translations are in psychology, are in marketing, are in different fields, so also differences in genre registers, etc. Okay. Let's see what we did and how we try to address these issues. Okay, so first of all, for target language salience or magnetism, we tried to use dependency bigrams, so pairs of lexical items that are connected through what we think might reasonably be a collocational relationship. You can see all the list here, so I don't have time to read it with examples as well. So once we'd extracted all these pairs from the two data sets, we ranked them according to their frequency and mutual information and log dice values in a reference corpus of English, and we followed Durant and Schmidt and Granger and Bestgen in this, who looked at learner data. And okay, so various kinds of filtering, and then we tried to make sure that the comparison would be reliable by comparing, by student, so the output by the students and not by the texts, and also using this kind of this procedure that should make it make the comparison more solid in terms of the results when the data sets are so small, especially the 19 students of the translation corpus. Okay, so for the two other methods, we simply went completely qualitative. So we selected a manageable subset of collocations. We looked at whether they were included in at least one bilingual dictionary, and then tried to see how many were in the essay-only corpus, in the translation-only corpus, and in the shared corpus. We also controlled for the lemmas in the collocations, not the relation, but both lemmas had to be present somewhere in the two corpora, because otherwise we would see effects that had to do simply with different topics being dealt with in the two corpora. So the lemmas had to be the same, but not in the same relation, or not connected, but present in at least one of the texts. For source language prominence, we used the same qualitative subset that you've just seen. And then once we had found a source language equivalent from the dictionary, we used that. If it wasn't in the dictionary, we used Google Translate using some context. And if we had more than one equivalent, we tested all of them for frequency in the source language corpus and picked the one with the highest mutual information log dice score. And for translations, we use their source texts. Same scoring as in the target language corpus. So we had these three sets of data, and I'll show you quickly some results. So our translations are more collocational than the essays, especially in terms of mutual information. Both comparisons return significant results, but the mutual information analysis had much stronger effect, whereas the log dice analysis was much more uncertain. But again, this goes, this is in line with the results from the previous studies, where you had more frequency related effects in the learners than the native speakers. So it seems that that in the translation corpus, when translating, students are more able to select more highly salient collocations than when they're producing their own texts in the second language. The connectivity results, no difference. So between the essays only and the translation only corpus, there's no difference in the number of collocations we see in the text that are also there in the dictionary. But with the shared pairs, they're much more likely. We don't know how much, again, no significance testing, because we looked at about 300 collocations, so very little data, but the shared pairs are more likely to be connected. So maybe because they belong to a more general phraseology that's useful in more than one communicative setting. And finally, for source language prominence, if the collocations that had high mutual information and high likelihood in the target language derived from collocations that had also high mutual information, even higher mutual information in the source text, assuming that we looked at the right source language equivalents, with the exception of log dice in the essays. But consider that these students had never read about any probably English linguistic topics in Italian. So we feel that it's more likely that over their course, they had become more familiar with the more frequent collocations in English. So the effect of the source language would be not as strong in this case. Okay, so my conclusions: the translations are more collocational than the essays. The connectivity doesn't seem to affect the two modes strongly, and it does affect the source language salience does affect both types of writing. However, there are enormous limitations, because the method for research question 2 and 3 are qualitative and very, very exploratory, looking at a subset of data. So we can't really be sure. And I'm going to open up the discussion here, and then if I have 1 minute, I'll play a little audio. Yes, 5 minutes should be okay. Great. So first of all, the investigation of physiological features of constrained communication. Is it possible? I mean, is it feasible? All the studies that have approached constrained communication of late have done so adopting multifactorial approaches, modeling the different modes of production based on outcomes that usually have 2 or 3 possible outcomes, and looking at how the factors would impact the choice of these 2 or 3 factors. So it works really well for grammar, but I'm not sure how well it would work when you have lexis and phraseology, whenever you're trying to compare different sets of data, you run into issues because texts deal with different subjects, different topics, and you can't avoid that. Okay, so I think it's an issue. However, that's what interests me. So I don't want to change the object of analysis because I can't find a good method for addressing that. You see, so that's why I'm thinking about this. Then we can think of these differences in terms of task effects. So that translation leads to a way of producing text that differs from bilingual writing. But there's also the issue of opportunity of use that was mentioned in Hilary's talk the other day. These people will translate. These people will not only write in the, or maybe they will never write in the foreign language academic texts. So when we see what they're capable of doing in translation, that's also valuable because it's one of the skills they will be using in real life. So if they can produce high MI, highly salient collocations in the second language, maybe they might be better than they seem when they write their own essays, because their language competence might actually be better than what we can observe in their own independent writing. Also because in their own independent writing, they don't have ideas sometimes. You know, whereas when they translate, they have someone else's idea to convey. And maybe they're better at that. The question of the subjective distance between source and target, which has been observed repeatedly in second language and learner language studies, how do we know what the source language item was in the mind of the student? Well, when you have translations, you have some data on that, because you can see what they reacted to, not simply what the hypothesized equivalent might have been in the source language. The question of naturalistic versus experimental data. I feel that we're moving more and more toward experimental data because we need to control for variables, because we want all the factors available. So I'm wondering, is corpus linguistics still an adequate method, or shouldn't we turn to experimental data completely? So that's my provocative question. And finally, are these learner corpora, are translation learner corpora? Because to me, they're probably data sets, because you'll never be able to use them all together. It wouldn't make sense to use all these texts together. So when you have this idea of a corpus and subcorpora, still you feel that you have some unity out of the different subcorpora, but these are really data sets that you build corpora out of. So I think it would be easier or less confusing to think about these data sets as sources for corpora rather than corpora. And my afterthought, final afterthought. While I was working towards the contribution to MUST, I was reminded of this claim by Barbara Seidelhofer, who said, pedagogy has to be local, designed for specific learners and settings. And also the following claim on the idea that exploring these data may be extremely valuable, and maybe we don't do that as much as we might, using the learner data together with the learner, for which reason I tried to, yes, that's perfect, because I have 1 minute audio file to play to you if it works, and then I will even not need to conclude. This is so this will be the end of the talk. I will leave you with that. It's an audio file that is going to be quite embarrassing for me, because I'm going to play 1 minute from an annotation session for MUST that I had with a student. So us discussing how to annotate part of a text.
Qui ci potrebbero essere interpretazioni diverse. Chiediamo alle persone, ma secondo voi?
Sì, io senza dubbio ho segnato delle cose che probabilmente non saranno veri errori, perché magari ho sbagliato io. Per esempio nella prima frase, nel primo paragrafo, un'intervista con l'autore l'ho sempre segnato come una interferenza con l'inglese, perché pensavo fosse... Però cioè in italiano diciamo che suona, però allo stesso tempo è curioso che invece di usare la formula un'intervista a, che è quella che si usa più spesso, ci sia un'intervista con,
Hai ragione.
dato che il testo in inglese è an interview with. Però comunque, nel senso, a me suona in italiano.
Solo che ti potrebbe suonare perché ormai è un po' che leggiamo interferenze
Che l'ho detto
dall'inglese.
8 volte, sì, esatto.
Sì, e poi comunque c'è anche lì, se chiedi, io per esempio non ci avevo proprio neanche fatto caso, capito? È che noi ormai siamo talmente abituati a leggere
Esatto.
sia in inglese sia cose tradotte dall'inglese che... Però hai ragione, si direbbe un'intervista a qualcuno, non
Esatto.
un'intervista con qualcuno.
Infatti io quello penso di averlo segnato come interferenza
Interessante.
con il source language.
Thank you.